his fellow friars prayed over him for the 24 hours before the funeral mass was held in the church upstairs. At the front of the altar, we see a French artist from the 1930s conception of purgatory, which is where the church teaches that Christians with unresolved venial sins go to purge those sins before their final salvation. At the upper level, we see the Blessed Virgin accompanied with various angels. I want to draw your attention to the cups that the angels are holding and pouring over the poor souls in purgatory. These cups do not contain water or any other type of liquid, but instead represent the prayers of the faithful who are still alive, said for the poor souls in purgatory who cannot pray for themselves. Every November 2nd, on All Souls Day, the church as a whole prays for the poor souls in purgatory, and of course we can do so for departed family members at any time during the year. I want to next draw your attention to the mosaics on the walls around you, which represent famous scenes of death from the Bible. So on your left, you see Christ's lifeless body being taken off of the cross. Behind you, you see the story from the Mary and Martha story with Christ raising their brother and his beloved friend Lazarus from the dead. And here on your right, the scene of Ezekiel with the dead being raised from their graves on Judgment Day. I always find very interesting that most of the faithful are represented in skeletal form, which of course makes sense because many of these have been dead for hundreds of years. An exception to that being this gentleman over here, who the older friars tell us that that is the face of the artist who put that particular mosaic together. The last two things I'd like to draw your attention to are these twin mosaics. Here we see the Grim Reaper, here the angel from the book of Revelation pointing to the city of Jerusalem. These, of course, are both metaphors. The Grim Reaper represents death, the one guarantee that the church makes for all of us. Every person born will at one point die. For those, however, who perform good works and are faithful, salvation also awaits. Now, we're next going to go up the corridor behind me and turn to the left to go into the chapel of St. Cecilia. There are seats around the outside of this chapel, and I invite you to please sit in them. Before we go, though, I'd like to draw your attention to these four small orange cones. The basilica in her honor in Rome, but originally she was buried in the catacombs. St. Cecilia was a young woman of high birth who, when the emperor discovered she was a Christian, sent an executioner to her house. The executioner took a large axe and took 3 attempts to behead St. Cecilia. He was unable to do so and dropped the axe and fled in terror. This statue, which is a replica of one in Rome, you can look at the neck and see the marks on her neck where the axe grazed her. After 3 days, St. Cecilia did die of loss of blood, but it is said that for the 3 days between that, when her members of her family and other Christians approached her to tend to her needs, they heard beautiful music. For this reason, to this day, St. Cecilia is the patron saint of both musicians and of music. This body, this statue also represents the way St. Cecilia's body looked several hundred years after her death when it was done. Unlike St. Benedict, who was a high-ranking general, St. Sebastian was a common foot soldier. When the emperor discovered that he was a Christian, he had him taken out, tied to a stake, and 40 archers took their bows and shot arrows into St. Sebastian. He remained tied to the stake for several hours, at which time his friends came and cut him down. They pulled the arrows out, and St. Sebastian's wounds miraculously healed. Now, there are reasons people are saints. If that had happened to me, once the arrows came out, I would have run for the hills. St. Sebastian, however, asked for and received an audience with the emperor, went before him and informed the emperor that the persecution of Christians was wrong, and asked him to please stop. At this time, the emperor had Saint Sebastian taken out and beaten to death. Saint Sebastian is, of course, a martyr for the faith, and he's the patron saint of both athletes and soldiers. And over the centuries, many miracles have been attributed to Saint Sebastian by soldiers on either sides of conflict who prayed to him for his intervention during battles. Next, come this way. The entire remains of Saint Innocent are here. Whatever remains of his face and head is covered with a wax mask, and he's wearing a wig. The friars have him dressed in a small white crusader's gown, but I want you to look carefully at his hands and his feet. These are both wrapped in gold mesh, and through that you can see the skeletal remains of his hands, his feet, and the little sandals the child was wearing at the time of his death. At the end of the case, there's a small vial that contains St. Innocent's blood. We will walk by, you may pay your respects, and then you're going to turn to the right and join the chapel, a replica of a mosaic from that church. And at the far left, we see the three magi. We see the infant Christ in his creche. We see the Holy Mother tending to his needs. We see some livestock, an angel, St. Joseph, a shepherd, and the shepherd's dog. When I first began volunteering to do these tours, I, of course, had always heard that Christ was born in a stable, which indeed he was, but the stable was also a cave. Apparently, outside of the city of Bethlehem are a series of caves that for centuries have been used by the townspeople to store their livestock. Beneath the altar is the 14-point silver star that you saw in the video upstairs. This is the place in Bethlehem where the faithful can place their hands down and touch the place that Christ was born. The exact place that Christ was born, of course, remains in Bethlehem, but the stone in there is from the cave of the Nativity. To your right, you see another altar from the same church. This celebrates the creche where the infant Jesus was kept for 8 days after his birth. Above the altar, you see a painting of the Holy Family, and to the right, we see a representation of the three magi. This is nearly the conclusion of our tour. We're going to walk up these stairs where there is a beautiful